Throughout human history, the darker aspects of justice and punishment have manifested in methods designed not merely to execute, but to inflict maximum psychological and physical suffering. Among the most disturbing of these practices stands the Rat Barrel Torment, a torture technique that exploited one of humanity's most primal fears, being consumed alive by ravenous animals. This method, which combined confinement, animal aggression, and slow brutalization, represents a particularly cruel chapter in the annals of torture history. The Rat Barrel Torment emerged during an era when torture served multiple functions within the justice system, extracting confessions, punishing crimes, and serving as public spectacle to deter potential wrongdoers. While precise documentation of this specific method remains scarce in official records, torture practitioners rarely kept detailed accounts of their most brutal techniques. References to rat-based torture appear in various historical sources from medieval and early modern Europe. The practice appears most prominently in folklore and historical accounts from Central and Eastern European regions, particularly during periods of intense political upheaval and religious persecution. The Holy Roman Empire, with its fragmented political structure and localized justice systems, created conditions where particularly cruel punishments could be implemented by regional authorities with minimal oversight. Similarly, during the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the 16th century, accounts emerged of rat torture being used against suspected traitors and political dissidents. The use of animals in torture was not unique to rats. Historical records document various creatures being weaponized against human victims. Snakes, dogs, bears, and even insects were employed in different cultural contexts. However, rats held particular psychological significance in European societies. These rodents were associated with disease, filth, and the Black Death that had devastated the continent centuries earlier. The cultural revulsion toward rats amplified the horror of this torture method, adding layers of symbolic degradation to the physical suffering. Understanding how the Rat Barrel Torment functioned requires examining both its physical construction and the behavioral dynamics between humans and rodents under extreme stress. The apparatus itself was deceptively simple, which partially explains its historical persistence. It required no sophisticated equipment or specialized knowledge to construct and implement. The barrel used was typically a standard wooden container, similar to those used for storing grain or wine. The size varied depending on the torturer's intentions and available materials, but most accounts describe barrels just large enough to contain a human body in a crouched or curled position. This confined space served multiple purposes. It prevented the victim from effectively defending themselves, maximized contact with the rats, and amplified the psychological terror through claustrophobia. Holes were cut into the barrel's surface, usually along the sides and sometimes the bottom. These openings served contradictory purposes that heightened the victim's suffering. They allowed torturers to introduce rats into the container while the victim was already sealed inside, creating moments of fresh terror as each new rodent entered. The holes also provided minimal ventilation, keeping the victim conscious throughout the ordeal, while simultaneously offering tantalizing glimpses of the outside world that remained forever out of reach. The number of rats introduced varied based on the severity of punishment intended and the duration the torture was meant to last. Historical accounts mention anywhere from a handful to dozens of rodents being placed inside the barrel. The rats themselves became unwilling participants in the torture, as their natural instinct for survival drove their aggressive behavior toward the human victim. To fully comprehend the horror of this torture method, one must understand rat behavior under stress. Rats are generally cautious creatures that avoid confrontation with larger animals, including humans. However, when trapped in confined spaces with no escape route and competing for limited oxygen and space, their behavior transforms dramatically. In the enclosed barrel environment, rats experienced intense stress that triggered defensive and panic-driven behaviors. Unable to escape and confronted with a large, warm body that occupied most of their confined space, the rodents would instinctively attempt to burrow and climb, using their sharp claws and powerful incisors. Rats possess teeth that grow continuously throughout their lives, requiring constant gnawing to maintain. These teeth can exert tremendous pressure and easily pierce human skin and tissue. The rat's desperation increased as oxygen levels dropped and carbon dioxide accumulated inside the barrel. Suffocation anxiety would drive the animals into frenzied activity, escalating their attacks on the victim. The darkness inside the barrel, combined with the acoustics of the wooden container, would amplify every scratch, squeak, and movement, creating a soundscape of horror that attacked the victim's psyche as aggressively as the rats attacked their body. Victims faced not only physical pain, but profound psychological torture. The anticipation of each bite, the inability to see attacks coming in the darkness, the knowledge that escape was impossible, and the gradual realization that death would come slowly through countless small injuries rather than one merciful blow, all combined to create an experience of pure terror. While the barrel represented one implementation of rat torture, historical sources describe variations that shared the same fundamental principle of using trapped rodents as instruments of suffering. One particularly notorious variant involved placing a metal cage or pot containing rats against the victim's abdomen or chest, then heating the container from the outside. As the metal grew hot, the trapped rats, desperate to escape the heat, would burrow into the victim's body, eating through flesh and organs in their frantic attempt to find a cooler environment. This heated variation appears more frequently in historical accounts, possibly because it offered torturers greater control over the procedure and more predictable results. The Dutch Revolt provides several documented cases of this method being employed, and it resurfaces in accounts from other political upheavals throughout European history. Another variation involved binding victims in ways that exposed vulnerable areas of their bodies to rats while allowing the rodents freedom of movement. Rather than trapping both victim and rats together, this method created a situation where the victim remained helpless while rats, attracted by baits or smells, would attack exposed flesh. This approach lacked the psychological intensity of complete confinement, but allowed for prolonged torture sessions that could be interrupted and resumed. Separating historical fact from embellished legend presents significant challenges when researching extreme torture methods. Official court records and legal documents typically employed euphemistic language when describing torture, if they mentioned it at all. Phrases like "put to the question" or "extraordinary examination" concealed the brutal realities of what transpired in dungeons and interrogation chambers. Most detailed descriptions of rat torture come from secondary sources: chronicles written by observers, propaganda documents created by one faction against another, and later historical compilations that drew from oral traditions and fragmentary records. This creates an evidentiary problem for historians attempting to determine how widespread the practice actually was versus how prominent it became in collective cultural memory. Propaganda considerations complicate matters further. During periods of conflict, opposing sides regularly accused each other of employing barbaric torture methods, sometimes exaggerating or inventing practices to demonize their enemies. The Spanish Black Legend, for instance, attributed numerous cruelties to Spanish authorities in the Netherlands, some documented and others likely exaggerated for political purposes. Similarly, Protestant and Catholic factions during the Reformation era exchanged accusations of torture, each side portraying the other as uniquely barbaric. Despite these complications, sufficient references exist across diverse sources to confirm that rat-based torture did occur, even if the exact frequency and geographic distribution remain uncertain. The persistence of these accounts across different time periods and regions suggests they reflect real practices rather than pure invention. Understanding rat barrel torment requires placing it within the broader context of early modern justice systems and social attitudes toward punishment. Torture occupied an officially recognized role in legal proceedings across much of Europe until the 18th century. The Carolina Code of 1532, which standardized criminal law across the Holy Roman Empire, explicitly permitted torture under specific circumstances, primarily to extract confessions from suspects when other evidence proved insufficient. However, even within legal frameworks that sanctioned torture, limits theoretically existed. Torture was supposed to be proportionate to the crime, applied only when strong suspicion already existed, and conducted under proper authority. The reality often diverged from these guidelines, particularly during periods of political instability or when dealing with crimes considered especially heinous, such as treason, heresy, or witchcraft. Rat torture fell into a category of extreme punishment typically reserved for those considered enemies of the state or threats to social order. The cruelty of the method reflected the perceived severity of the victim's transgressions. Political rebels, religious heretics, and accused traitors faced harsher treatment than common criminals because their crimes threatened the fundamental structures of power and authority. Public torture and execution also served important social functions beyond punishment. These spectacles reinforced power hierarchies, demonstrated the state's authority over life and death, and theoretically deterred others from similar crimes. The more dramatic and memorable the punishment, the more effective it presumably was as deterrence. This logic encouraged authorities to develop increasingly elaborate and cruel methods, creating a grim competition in suffering. For those who survived rat torture, and survival was possible if the torture was halted before fatal injuries occurred, the psychological scars often exceeded the physical wounds. The experience left victims with profound trauma that manifested in various ways: intense phobias of rodents and confined spaces, nightmares and flashbacks, difficulty sleeping in darkness, and hypervigilance regarding sounds and movements. Medieval and early modern societies lacked modern understanding of psychological trauma, but contemporary accounts occasionally hint at the lasting mental effects. Survivors described as never the same or broken in spirit likely suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The social stigma attached to having been tortured, often associated with confession of crimes or betrayal of accomplices, compounded the psychological burden. The torturers themselves were not immune to psychological effects. Historical sources occasionally mention executioners and torture specialists suffering from alcoholism, social isolation, and mental instability. The work of inflicting extreme suffering, even when sanctioned by law and authority, exacted its own toll on those who performed it repeatedly. The gradual abandonment of judicial torture across Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries stemmed from multiple converging factors: Enlightenment philosophy that emphasized human dignity and rational justice, growing skepticism about confessions extracted under duress, reform movements led by intellectuals and legal theorists, and evolving standards of civilization that increasingly viewed torture as barbaric and ineffective. Cesare Beccaria's influential treatise on crimes and punishments, published in 1764, articulated systematic arguments against torture. Beccaria noted that torture was more likely to produce false confessions from the weak than true confessions from the guilty, undermining its ostensible purpose within the justice system. His work influenced legal reforms across Europe, though implementation proceeded unevenly. Prussia abolished torture in 1740, followed by other German states, and eventually most of Europe by the early 19th century. However, extrajudicial torture conducted outside formal legal processes, persisted longer, particularly in colonial contexts and during periods of political upheaval. Though judicial torture disappeared from Western legal systems, the Rat Barrel Torment and similar methods retained cultural presence through literature, folklore, and historical memory. These stories served various functions: cautionary tales about tyranny, examples of human cruelty that must be prevented, and unfortunately, sometimes inspiration for those seeking to inflict suffering in modern contexts. The 20th century witnessed torture's resurgence despite international legal prohibitions. While modern torture typically employed different methods, electrical shock, waterboarding, stress positions, the fundamental logic remained: using pain and psychological breakdown to extract information or punish enemies. Some authoritarian regimes even revived historical methods, demonstrating that technological advancement in society does not automatically translate to moral progress. Contemporary human rights law explicitly prohibits torture under all circumstances, classifying it as a crime against humanity. The United Nations Convention Against Torture, adopted in 1984, created binding international obligations. Yet enforcement remains inconsistent, and torture continues in various forms worldwide, a sobering reminder that legal prohibitions alone cannot eliminate practices that authorities find useful.